Chapter 41, The Montreal Screwjob. It was November 8th, the night before Survivor Series 97. I was in the dressing room at Cobo Hall in Detroit. Vince and I were still stalemated. I was worn out with conflicting emotions, grief vying with an adrenaline rush of clarity. I was convinced Vince would ruin me just for the sick pleasure of it. I kept reminding myself that if I'd stayed in the WWF, Sean and Hunter would have done all they could to drive me out anyway. Jack Lanza pulled me aside to tell me that I was doing the right thing for the business. I wouldn't drop the belt to that little motherfucker either. I never knew whether Jack meant what he said or was trying to provoke a reaction out of me that would somehow play into his boss's hands. I called Earl Heckner into a dingy dressing room bathroom. I looked him right in the eyes and said, "Tomorrow, Earl, they're going to ask you to fuck me." His mouth twisted and his eyes filled with tears as he promised, "I swear on my kids' heads I won't do it. I'll quit first. If they ask me to do that, I'll tell them to go fuck themselves. Brett, I swear." I calmed him down, saying that all he had to do was tell me what the plan was, and I'd take care of it. I told him that I was going to insist that he be the ref because I trusted him to watch my back. The longer we talked, the stronger his resolve became. I'll never forget the tears in his eyes as he shook my hand. Word had leaked out that I was going to WCW, and all during the six-man tag that night I was tormented by a jeering mob chanting, "You sold out." It bothered me that they didn't know I was pushed out, but at the end of the match, when I took my walk around the ring, my fans hugged me, and many broke down crying. I kept feeling as though I was alive at my own funeral. My worries about what would happen the next day in Montreal tormented me all night long. Vince and I were eyeball to eyeball and nobody was blinking. I'll never understand why Sean couldn't simply put me over, with me immediately dropping the belt to him on Raw, where a much bigger audience would see his win. I'd have my respect, and Sean would have the belt. I met Julie and the kids at the hotel in Montreal, and in no time at all, it seems, I was barging up the back ramp of the Molson Center with them, Paul J's camera crew filming every step. Though Paul had wrapped up filming in September, I'd suggested he might want to film my last match for the WWF in Canada. Julie and the kids were swept up in emotional farewells. Blade and Beans were too young to understand completely what was going on, but they knew it wasn't good. I went looking for Vince, and Paul suggested that I keep my hidden mic on. Vince said hello to Julie and the kids, smiling and kidding with them briefly, before we headed to his dressing room for a talk. He spotted the bright red poppy pinned to my shirt, and I explained how it was a Remembrance Day tradition. I brought up how this Canadian angle had really painted me into a corner. It would be hard for me to come up short as a hero today. I bluntly asked, "So what is it that you want to do?" Vince was grim-faced. "What do you want to do?" Because word about me leaving had leaked out, I suggested some kind of run-in. I told him I'd win tonight, and then I'd forfeit the belt on Raw in Ottawa the next day. This was a suggestion, not a demand. We talked about how we both felt betrayed. I brought up that nobody was supposed to know that I was leaving, but he was already smearing my reputation. Vince likened it to sticking me with a stick, which I took as his admission that he'd been poking at me intentionally to provoke me. Finally, Vince said that he was determined to see this come out the right way. I sighed with relief, believing I now had the dignified exit I sought. Vince's tone softened as he said, "All we're talking about is Ted Turner. It's what's coming between you and me. That's all. I can't tell you how appreciative I will always be for everything you've done for this company. I'll be damned. Even if it is Ted Turner's money and all that kind of shit, that's no reason for two people who've spent as much time as we have together, worked closely through the years, it's no reason to have any problems." I couldn't agree more, I said. I didn't want to ever leave here. What matters to me is what happens to me right now. It might be all that I'm ever going to be remembered for. I don't have high hopes for down there. I loved my story here. My history will always be here, which is why I've been so stubborn. After 14 years, to end it here on such a bad note wouldn't be right. I'm going to miss this place. So we'll leave it on that? Aha. Okay. Feels better. Yeah. I smiled then and said, "You never know, you might have me back someday." Vince chuckled. "Loved to." I pushed for clarity, "So, what is it you want to do today then?" Vince then described in detail how DX would interfere when I had Sean in the sharpshooter. The Hart Foundation would charge out to my rescue, and we'd end up in a big schmaz, or brawl, where he wanted me to deck Hunter and even China. "The marks out there are thinking this is a shoot," he said. "I'm going to capitalize on that. I won't be out there commentating, and there'll be a slew of uniformed security at ringside. I'm open to anything." "All right," I said and shook his hand. "I'll go find Sean and go over all this." "Whatever you want," said Vince. "I put you with Pat. He's the master to work it through." A few minutes later, Carlo took me around back of the Molson Center, where I told him that Vince had decided to let me leave with my head up. Carlo broke down crying. In many ways, Carlo had brought me to this moment. He'd helped to structure the contract that gave me way too much power for it ever to rest easy with Vince or to allow to stand as a precedent. I trusted that contract to protect me. If it wasn't for me, Carlo wouldn't be where he was and neither would I. After taking my mic off and changing into my gear, I found Sean. One last time I tried to be straight with him. He was visibly nervous and said he wanted no problems with me, that he had no problems doing anything. Pat told me that he thought it would be a hell of a spot to let Sean put me in the sharpshooter and then reverse it on him. It would be a great spot that would set the stage for a fantastic second half. "Who's the ref?" I asked. "Earl," Pat said. I smiled to myself. Okay. I ran the whole scenario by Earl, Owen, Davey, and Rude while Hunter and China meekly nodded their heads in approval. Vader pulled me aside to warn me. "Be careful out there, brother. Vince is known for fucking people in these kinds of situations." "I've got it covered," I assured him, lowering my voice. People still ask me, "Didn't you see it coming?" The truth was I'd been reasonable in every way, and with Earl watching my back I thought I had nothing to worry about. I paced around backstage and waited. When I heard Sean's music drowned out by boos, I had no idea that he had just pretended to wipe his ass with a Canadian flag and then laid it out in the middle of the ring and pretended to fuck it hard. Back home in Calgary, Stu was watching in disgust. He took very real offense to Sean's actions, as did everyone in the building and all across Canada. If I'd done that in the United States, I might have been lynched. I grabbed my own flag, handed it to Blade and said, "Let's go, boy." He marched all the way to the curtain with me, Jim, Davey, and Owen, with Paul J's crew trailing right behind us. Hunter was not where he was supposed to be for the run-in. An annoyed Rick Rude was suspicious. He pursed his lips and told me, "Watch your back in case they try to jump you or pull anything funny on you out there." Excitement and doubt pulsed through me as my music blared. I disappeared through the curtain to an explosion of noise. I entered the ring tense but unafraid, and proud. If Sean so much as tried anything, I'd take him out hard and fast. Sean jumped me before the bell, but I battled right back, and we began working. We fought through the crowd, with me decking agents and referees one after another. Somewhere in the middle of it I locked eyes with Vince and shook my fist at him. Sean was flopping and flying for me everywhere. Before long I had a blue and white Quebec flag wrapped around Sean's neck, and the Molson Center was coming apart at the seams. Only when I finally got him into the ring did the bell signal the start of the match. Halfway through what was to be a 30-minute match, I made my way to the top corner. When I leapt off, Sean pulled Earl in front of me, and the collision left both me and Earl sprawled out on the mat. Sean then stepped over me to put on the sharpshooter, but he crossed my legs wrong, so I called up to him, the other way, and he switched them. As Sean turned me onto my stomach, I saw Earl for a split second motioning with his fingers and Vince, strangely, standing at the ring apron wearing an angry scowl. Then he screamed at the bell ringer, "Mark Eaton, ring the bell. Ring the fucking bell." Eaton, in stunned disbelief, couldn't bring himself to do it. I frantically tried to reverse the sharpshooter on Sean as Vince snapped hard at Eaton, and the bell clanged over and over. I couldn't believe Earl fucked me. It felt like all the blood in my veins had just evaporated. Earl jumped out of the ring and ran away as fast as he could toward Jack Lanza and Dave Heckner, who were waiting at the top of the ramp with a car running. My first thought was that I'd somehow let the whole country down. Sean put on a show, cussing and carrying on as if he wasn't in on the whole thing. I saw Vince on the floor. The thought crossed my mind to jump out and go crazy on him. I looked over at Mark Eaton, his mouth open and tears in his eyes. I leaned over the top rope, carefully aimed, and spit at Vince, hitting him right between the eyes. I saw Sean hoisting the belt in the air in victory, and then being hustled away down the aisle by Hunter and Jerry Briscoe. Vince kept trying to wipe my spit from his eyes. The crowd totally got what had just happened and began angrily chanting, "Bullshit! Bullshit!" The Montreal fans were outraged. A spark was all it would take to have a full-scale riot, and that was a bad idea. I had to calm myself and think smart. What would my dad do? Looking out at the stunned crowd, I fought the tears that were swimming in my eyes and thought, "Don't you dare give these backstabbers the satisfaction of seeing you cry over any of this. Don't you dare cry. I worked so hard for him 14 years, all I wanted was my dignity." They'd cut the ring mic, but the cameras were still rolling, so I painted WCW in giant letters in the air for all to see. Owen, Davey, and Jim soon surrounded me. Owen said, "You don't look bad for this." "They do. You were all class. When I met their eyes, I could feel myself dying inside. My lower lip started to quiver, so I bit it. Owen stood beside me, and his strength helped me keep it together. He told me that he and Rick had been duped into looking everywhere for Hunter, when Hunter was at ringside all along. For what seemed like an eternity, I looked out at the sea of sad people who felt as betrayed as I did, knowing what disrespect had been paid to me, my family and millions of fans all around the world. I told myself to never forget this feeling, ever. I jumped down from the ring and commenced smashing Vince's expensive TV monitors to the floor and tossing his headsets out into the crowd, surrounded by security guards who couldn't quite figure out whether this was part of the storyline. On my way backstage, I passed by Blade, who looked equally sad and puzzled, and then by Julie and the rest of the kids, all of them shocked to silence. Surrounded by Paul's crew, I headed straight for Vince's office and tried to break the steel door down. I gave up and walked back toward the dressing room, hounded by Japanese reporters who thought I'd explain everything that had happened for them right then and there. I felt like the Terminator. I wasn't the only one. I saw the Harris twins kicking over barrels of garbage and punching the walls. The wrestlers were ready to riot too. Nothing to do but go home now. Blade trailed after me as I headed to the dressing room, but when I got to there, I found my bag sitting out in the hallway. I picked it up and walked inside only to see Sean sitting in the corner. Sean, you weren't in on that? I swear to fucking God, I had nothing to do with it. You weren't in on it? So help me God, I don't know anything about it. He threw the belt on the floor and said he refused to wear it. Paul J's camera crew were right behind me filming everything they could. I wanted to rip Sean to shreds. Deep down I knew he was in on it all the way, but I didn't want to lose my cool in front of Blade. Sean, I said, I'll judge you by what you do tomorrow on TV. I looked around at a room full of stricken wrestlers and calmly said, if they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. Remember that. Taker blew his stack and shouted, fuck. I'm gonna bring his ass down here. I want Vince to explain himself to me, you and everyone else. He kicked the dressing room door open. As he stomped off down the hall, I could hear angry wrestlers calling out to Taker where he could find Vince. Paul's crew left so I could undress. I somehow found some humor in the fact that after his match Davey had borrowed my towel, as he often did, leaving me without one as I headed to the showers. My head was spinning and my heart had a giant hole in it as the water poured over me. Rick Rude and Davey appeared just out of range of the showers to tell me that, true to his word, Taker had made Vince open his door. Vince had rounded up a makeshift crew of bodyguards consisting of Slaughter, Briscoe and his son Shane. I had my friends Taker, Shamrock, Foley, Vader, Rude, Crush, Savio and especially Owen, Davey, and Jim. This whole thing could turn into a damn mutiny, or worse. Finally Vince came down the hall with his posse and stepped into the dressing room. He says he wants to talk to you, Rick called to me in the shower. Tell Vince to get the hell out of here before he gets hurt. Rick and Davey returned seconds later and told me in unison, he says he's staying. I told them to please warn him to leave. If he stays, he's gonna get knocked out. But they came back with the same answer. I came out of the shower sopping wet, with no towel, and calmly walked past Vince. I was actually thinking that if they ever did a movie about this, it wouldn't look very good if I beat Vince up naked. As I picked up a damp towel from the floor, Vince dryly offered, it's the first time I ever had to lie to one of my talent. Who are you kidding, you lying piece of shit? I shot back. Sean now sat crying in the corner. Briscoe and Slaughter tried to clear everyone out of the dressing room. Owen was about to leave when Davey grabbed him by the arm. Don't leave, he said. Remember what happened to Bruiser Brody? None of my boys left. With Davey, Rick, Owen and Jim on my left, I sat down and glared at Vince, surrounded by his henchmen, who all stood with their arms behind their backs. Taker was also there, offering me full support. Sean was still blubbering like a baby, his head in his hands. He told me I could leave any way I wanted. That I was Cal Ripken. That I was doing you a favor. That you appreciated everything I ever did. That for everything I've done there was no reason for any problems. You've told me nothing but lies all week, all fucking year. I said in a surprisingly calm voice. Then I added, if you're still here when I'm finished getting dressed, I'll have no choice but to punch you out. Vince seemed unfazed, even tried to take credit for my deal with Turner, but I cut him off to remind him that I'd taken the lesser deal from Vince because I'd wanted to stay loyal to him. After 14 years, you just couldn't let me leave with my head up? I shot him down on every lie. I was calm and rational as I sized up the room and who was where, noticing too the look on Owen's face. I could see he was afraid of what it might be like to stay on with Vince after this, whatever this was over, but that he was backing me to the fullest. Like one of my best matches, I could see it all play out in my head. I knew a fight with Vince was likely to come down to a half-assed pull-apart, so I intentionally left my shirt off so no one could grab it. I'd be lucky if I got one good shot in before they all pounced on me. When I tied the laces of my high tops, I stood up and said, "Okay." I picked up my knee brace, thinking to smash Vince over the head with it, but I tossed it down, declaring, "I won't need this," and went straight for him. Cockily Vince came back at me and we actually tied up. 14 fucking years. I launched a rocket launcher uppercut that connected with Vince's jaw. My right fist actually popped him like a cork off the ground, and he collapsed unconscious to the carpet. His cavalry jumped in, but they were too late. I found myself jostling with Jerry Briscoe, who I would find out later was the one who had designed the whole screwjob for Vince. I told him if he so much as touched me again, I'd give him exactly the same as I'd given Vince, and the lying little coward backed away with his hands up. For the next 40 seconds we all stared at Vince unconscious, splayed like an X on the floor. I calmly took my seat again and noticed that my hand was throbbing. I thought it might be broken. Shane pulled Vince into a sitting position and pleaded with me to let his father get his bearings. I thought of my dad, who had been at home watching me get screwed on live TV, and my sons out in the hallway, and I remembered that Paul J. was just outside the door. Vince was blowing like a horse, still out of it, and I couldn't help but think that maybe Paul should capture some of this. I angrily shouted, "Get him out." Slaughter and Briscoe dragged him backward by the armpits and plopped him on the bench across from me. I stood up and snatched my knee brace with a wild, mad look on my face, and I think I meant it when I shouted, "Get him the fuck out right now or I'll finish him with this." When I came toward him, Shane and his helpers propped Vince on his feet and walked him limping out the door. I would find out later that my punch lifted him high enough off the ground that when he came down he rolled his ankle and nearly broke it. And as history would have it, Paul filmed a dazed Vince staggering down the hall. The dressing room was now quiet, except for Sean sniffling. I walked toward him thinking I should kick the shit out of him too, while I had the chance. Instead I held out my hand. "Thanks for the match, Sean." He shook my broken hand and started crying even harder. It all seemed so surreal. After a few more moments of silence, Jim said with a mischievous smile, "I guess they won't say anything to me anymore about smashing TV monitors." Rude, Taker, Owen, Jim and Davey all burst out laughing. When I got back to my hotel I asked Marcy, who was seething over how I'd been treated, to get the truth out to the media and the fans before Vince rewrote history, and with her vast network of contacts, I knew she could. It was an international news story before Vince's damage control team had their morning coffee, and by then it was too late for Vince to smooth it over. The next afternoon, while I was on the plane home, Vince had a talent meeting at Raw in Ottawa, during which more than a few of the boys nearly quit. After the match, wrestlers kept calling my hotel room saying that they wanted to boycott Raw. I deeply appreciated their support but told them to think of their families first. Ken Shamrock was one of those who nearly quit. Davey and Owen came home too. Davey pretended that he had re-injured his knee during the scuffle with Vince, but Owen didn't offer any excuse. Mick Foley actually quit. I had no hard feelings about anyone staying on with Vince, including Jim, Davey, and Owen. I left it up to them. If things got rough for all of them, I'd see if Eric was interested in any of them, but only if they wanted me to. On the plane home I'd been so dejected that my fist held up my chin the whole way, looking out the window with the occasional tear rolling down my cheek. I couldn't stop them and I didn't feel like hiding it. Jay just kept patting my hand. Paul J's crew filmed me on the plane. I couldn't understand why Paul was so happy. He kept saying to me, "You're going to love what I got," but I wasn't getting it because I was literally in shock. Paul said the god of documentaries had shone down on him in Montreal and he had the whole conversation I'd had with Vince before the match on tape. But I wasn't processing what he said. At home on Monday night I couldn't bring myself to watch Raw, so I called Marcy to find out what happened. When she told me that Sean had walked out with the belt, said how he'd beaten me in my own country with my own finishing move, and had run me out of the WWF, I finally knew for certain that Sean had been full of shit when he swore to God that he wasn't in on it. Marcy was on a relentless campaign to get the truth out, and on a leap of faith she contacted Dave Meltzer. She'd never spoken to him before because she knew that I would have considered it a betrayal, despite the fact that it was clear that Meltzer had by this point become pro wrestling's most accurate chronicler. After a lengthy conversation with him, she pointed out to me that the one thing Vince seemed to be counting on to eventually save his ass on this is that I would never expose the business, and she suggested I talk to Dave. Had been considering it too, so on Tuesday, for the first time in my life, I gave Dave Meltzer a call. If Vince could do this to me, he could do it to any of the boys. I told Meltzer, "You don't have to take my word for this. You go ahead and try to disprove anything I'm telling you. He printed every word I said, at the risk of alienating the sources he needed to make his living. His meticulously detailed story about what has come to be called the Montreal Screwjob has never been refuted and is now considered a historic document in the history of pro wrestling. In the days after Montreal, it was rumored that Vince was going to lay assault charges against me. Apparently I broke his jaw and sprained his ankle. At first I thought, great, bring it on. Vince would have to sue me in Canada, exposing the truth about what happened in a court of law. I'd be happy to swear to God and explain myself. But Carlo kept calling, building fear in me about what could happen in a long, costly legal battle filled with uncertainty. I paced my pool room and briefly found myself wishing I'd never hit Vince. Then I shook my head and laughed at how surreal this all was continuing to be. They could put me in jail. They could do whatever the hell they wanted. And I knew someday I'd be sorry for a lot of things. But I'd never, ever be sorry for knocking that son of a bitch out. I didn't know at the time that Rick Rude had already called Eric Bischoff and told him everything that had happened. When I phoned Eric from my hotel room after the match, he howled with laughter over the fact that I had broken my hand on Vince's jaw. As far as he was concerned, the whole screwjob only made me hotter. On Nitro the day after Montreal, the NWO came out waving Canadian flags, and Bischoff called me a knockout kind of a guy. Hogan chimed in, he passed the initiation. Then Miss Elizabeth conducted as Bischoff, Hogan, Hennig, Macho, Nash, Razor, Kid, Conan, Virgil and the rest of the NWO sang the worst rendition of "Oh Canada" I've ever heard. But in many ways it was the best too. Stu and Helen were hurt by what Vince did to me. But Stu reiterated that, under the circumstances, I'd done the perfect thing. The love and support that my parents gave me was the only light I needed. If I'd beaten up Vince badly, I'd have looked pretty bad as well, but one punch was more than fair considering all the factors. What better way to say goodbye to a crooked boss than to deck him on my last day of work? Davey was trying to get out of his contract and was already talking to Eric. Owen had asked to be released, but Vince refused to let him out of his contract, even when he told Vince that I vowed to never talk to him again if he stayed. This was only a work, of course, but we both thought Vince might feel bad enough to go for it. When I approached Eric about my brother, he was interested, but he didn't want to pay Owen the same money he was making with Vince. As a favor to Owen, I spoke with Vince Russo on the phone. He'd gone from writing the WWF magazine to writing the shows, and we both thought of him as a friend. I told Russo angrily that McMahon wasn't good for his word and that it was impossible for Owen to trust anything he ever said again. My hostile tone wasn't directed at him, and Russo and I hung up on good terms. Seconds later, my phone rang, and to my startled amazement it was Vince McMahon. I concluded that he'd listened in on the entire call. He said, "I can't believe how truly selfish you are that you would want to hold back your brother Owen. How can you expect him to ever believe anything you say? If you say another word to Owen, I'll sue you so fast that you won't know what hit you. Vince, if you had an ounce of decency you'd let him go, or at least let him make his own decision. Well, I'm not letting him go. And I'm never going to let him go. And you better get used to it. If you keep doing what you're doing, messing with Owen's head, I'll sue you with a smile on my face. And I'll sue Owen for breach of contract too." He slammed the phone down. I called Owen to tell him what happened. I said I couldn't do anything more or Vince would sue us both. For some reason, Owen apologized. I told him not to worry. We would never let the wrestling business come between us. I'll always be here for you, Owen. Do what you gotta do and don't worry about me. Watch yourself. He'll be coming for you next, you watch. Watch your back, Owen, and I'll be waiting for you over at WCW. Just get home in one piece.